Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this Lumera webinar, looking at pensions dashboards from a small schemes perspective. It's great to see schemes here today, some of their advisors, even a pensions administration platform provider represented in the audience today. It's good to have that breadth of interest. Thank you. Small schemes may be small, but you don't need me to say that they're hugely important to their members, their trustees, and their employers. Collectively, they represent a very small proportion of the ultimate dashboard's population if you measure that by number of members. But if you measure that by the number of schemes, they represent a huge proportion. And we always have to remember that. In some ways, the challenge for small schemes is greater than that for large schemes. Small schemes have to go through the same process, do the same things, but they generally have much slimmer resources to do that with. And whether schemes are in-house managed or outsourced to a pensions administration provider, there is work to do on pensions dashboards. And of course, whether a member is linked to a very large scheme or a very small scheme or a scheme somewhere in between, that member has the same needs. So pensions dashboards is a truly important initiative to help active and deferred members prepare for retirement. Our aim today is to give small schemes key insights into pensions dashboards needs and to help small schemes address and overcome the challenges that are specific to them as small schemes. My name's Mark Adamson. I'm Commercial Director at Lumera, Commercial Director UK at Lumera. I'm your host today, and my main job is to make sure we squeeze everything in and finish on time at 11 o'clock. A brief word on Lumera if you don't know us. We're a pensions and life, financial technology and data company. Our headquarters is in Sweden, but a third of our people are here in the UK. We have about 200 here. As a result of Lumera acquiring ITM in the UK back in 2024. ITM is a company you may be more familiar with than Lumera, and ITM is the company I worked for and one of our other panelists today, Morris, worked for before Lumera came along. A few years ago, ITM developed a pensions dashboard connection product called Pension Fusion. We did that with our partners, Equisoft. Pension Fusion is widely used by in-house schemes, third-party administrators, and insurers, and we have over 16 million members already connected to the ecosystem through Pensions Fusion. I'm delighted to be able to introduce our three panelists today. We have Joe Eldridge. Joe is Industry Engagement Specialist at the Pensions Regulator. I'm sure many of you will have seen or heard Joe before. Likewise, Rekha Owen, who is an independent trustee at Law Debenture. More about Rekha and one or two other things later. And my colleague Morris Titley, who here at Lumera is Director for Data and Dashboards. And if you've been in any dashboards event in the last 4 years, you'll have heard Morris talk at some point, I'm sure. Rory, could we bring up the slide, please? So the event today is broken down into 4 sections. First of all, Joe from the Pensions Regulator is going to talk about what's expected of small schemes. We've then got a small scheme case study, a scheme of about 150 members that is already connected to the pensions dashboard. We'll then have a panel discussion on 3 topics: duties and expectations around pensions dashboards. We'll be talking governance and decision making, and we'll be talking about the practicality of connecting. And then finally, we'll have an audience Q&A at the end. Please don't wait until the end to ask your questions. If you want to ask a question, ask it as they occur to you, and you can do that by using the Q&A facility at the top of your screen. Just type in your question there, and we'll do our best to answer it later on. Your question can be anonymous if you prefer it to be, or it can be attached to your name. It's entirely up to you. By the way, we are recording this webinar, and more about that at the end, because we'll tell you about how you can see it subsequently if you'd like to watch it again. And really, probably that's enough from me for the moment. So let's get on with the expert panelists. We're going to start with Jo from the Pensions Regulator. She's going to talk about where we've got to, the risks of delaying connection, preparation of value data, and how pensions dashboards can transform the pension landscape. So Jo, all over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So I just wanted to start with a quick update on where we are with pensions dashboards. The headline is industry is making real measurable progress. And we have over 60 million pension records now connected. We know from sort of our insights that more than 80% of schemes are on track to meet their guidance dates. Where schemes have delayed their connection, it's typically down to administration transitions, consolidation, wind up or buyout ahead of October 2026. Consumer testing has started, so phase 1 testing has shown positive feedback on the design and user experience, and MAPS or the Money and Pension Service will share their findings soon. Phase 2 testing has now started, which is including a wider range of users across different demographics and pension types. So anyone aged over 18 who hasn't taken their pensions can participate in the testing. Money and Pension Service are especially keen to include people with access needs, low digital confidence or low literacy and numeracy. Industry and employers and charities are also encouraged to help support the recruitment, and more details can be found on the Pension Dashboards Programme's website. For TPR, our focus now is on the smaller schemes. So these are schemes with less than 1,000 relevant members. And that's approximately, like Mark said earlier, that's over 1,500 schemes that are connecting between January and September this year. But we just need to remember that all schemes must be connected by the 31st of October 2026, and failure to meet requirements may lead to penalties. Once connected, schemes must be able to find members and return data immediately within the required timelines. And these timelines are important because everybody's going to be trying to complete these tasks at once. The stage timeline was designed to manage capacity, and so connecting late means competing for limited onboarding resources. Industry experts have already anticipated bottlenecks caused by uncertainty and last-minute activity. And schemes need to have sufficient time to test, debug, do checks, and look at that end-to-end validation. And any delays in your connection can reduce the opportunities to have meaningful time to test, and you might not have the confidence in the performance without this time. And just to remember, connection is only the start. So once connected, trustees must stay up to date. It should be staying up to date with PDP and TPR guidance, really keeping dashboards and data as a regular board item on the agenda. Keep in touch with your administrators and anybody that's supporting you with dashboards duties, and really sort of prioritize improving your data, which should be digital and accurate and recent. Connecting is essential, but the quality of the data behind those connections is ultimately determining the success of dashboards. So moving on to my next slide, let's talk about data as a strategic asset. So data underpins everything. High quality data is essential for the reliable matching and accurate value reporting. It's not just about dashboards. There are other areas that will benefit from improved data, such as sort of funding, transactions, new technology adoption, better communication, planning for some long-term strategic decisions like consolidation and buyout. Data quality is and should be a strategic priority, not an operational afterthought. For dashboards, readiness can't be rushed. Poor data leads to failed matches, errors and escalations, issues that could become unmanageable under time pressure. We expect schemes to really prioritise their data. We have updated our member data guidance, which has set out clearer expectations and best practice. Perfect data isn't required, but strong governance, credible plans, and measurable progress are. This aligns with our compliance and enforcement approach, which is focused on preventing saver harm. So what are we seeing? So since September last year in 2025, we've engaged with the largest schemes covering over 80% of the membership in scope for dashboards. And we have been assessing matching and value data risks. We've also carried out our data quality regulatory initiative, which has shown that personal data cleansing has improved, but the value data, so this is the data that members see, is often lagging with inconsistent quality and governance. Some of the plans are strong, but others lack trustee oversight, and we can see that trustees are heavily reliant on third parties to support them. But dashboards does need find and view data. The value data will be providing current values, projected retirement income, and other benefits. If values are missing or misleading or inconsistent, dashboards can't support the meaningful decision making that members need. We know that some schemes are facing historic data debt from underinvestment, and that this does need to be addressed urgently. All of this preparation ultimately leads to one thing: how members are going to experience dashboards. So let's move to the next slide and look at how schemes can be preparing for that. So once schemes are connected, schemes must start preparing for member queries, especially where matches are uncertain or where dashboards spark a renewed interest in their pensions. Good engagement does start with good data, so the inaccurate data will lead to inaccurate messages and confusion. User testing provides a sort of a low risk opportunity to rehearse your communications, your data flows, and the admin processes end to end. Schemes will receive 6 months notice before the public launch, so you can start planning now. Start thinking, are your administration teams ready? How are you going to communicate dashboards? Can this integrate with routine member communications and portal updates? What do members already use? How do you already communicate with them? How do you think they're going to prefer to receive updates? You need to make sure everything is working before launch. And just sort of consider sort of the timing. You don't want to do it too early either. So that's why it's really important to take notice of when that 6-month launch is. Communicating too early with your members might cause some questions too early that you can't answer on dashboards. But user testing will also create queries as well. So you need to think about how you're going to deal with that. But this brings us back to that bigger picture of all this work we're doing ultimately delivers for savers and wider transformation that dashboards can unlock. So just moving to our last slide, dashboards are a major step forward in helping people see and understand their pensions. The Department for Work and Pensions research has shown that about 8 in 10 people will use a pension dashboard. So this is a clear signal of demand. Dashboards will also help people reconnect with lost pensions and see everything in one place, but they are not a silver bullet. They will make it far easier for savers to get a full picture and seek guidance or advice to plan for their retirement. But for members to truly benefit, schemes need to be concentrating more on just the technical connection. They need to be having accurate, up-to-date and digital data, and they need to be ready to support members as these queries increase. The ecosystem is coming together, and schemes that prepare now will be in a much stronger position when member activity increases. My message is simple: use this time well, keep data at the centre, and don't wait for the deadline to drive action. So that brings me to the end of my updates. And Mark, I'll hand back over to you to lead us into the discussion.
Mark, you're on mute.
Excellent. What a good host I am. Thank you, Morris. Apologies there. Before we move on to the discussion, we're going to take a look at the case study that we promised you. And we're going to do this by means of showing you a film. I'll come to that in a second. The case study is for a scheme called Fujifilm, a scheme of about 150 members. They wanted to get ahead of the game in terms of connection. And they approached Lumera through Rebecca Owen on our panel today. She is an independent trustee for Fujifilm. They've been through a series of steps, and in February this year, Fujifilm connected to the Pensions Dashboards ecosystem using Pension Fusion. So we're going to show you a film, and we're going to let Rob Fassam, who is a trustee of the scheme, and Natalie Gold, who is their administrator, tell their story. When we rehearsed showing this, we found there were some sound and vision sync issues. So if there are, I apologize, but hopefully the sound will be the most important feature. We're going to run that now. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Rob Fassam and I'm a trustee of a Fujifilm subsidiary pension scheme. It is a small DB scheme with internal administration and approximately 150 members. In 2024, we were conscious of the dashboard legislation and wanted to get ahead of the game. So with the support of our advisors, we looked for an off-the-shelf solution that would work for a small scheme like ours. The result of this was that we chose Pension Fusion as it seemed simple to use, efficient and compliant. Natalie, our pensions manager, will now show you our preparation for dashboards using this system.
The first step was preparing member data. Dashboards require accurate personal details for matching, so we started with the easy-to-use data load template. We took the personal details that will be used for matching from our admin system data records. The template made it clear which personal details to use for matching. We then added pension values calculated using Pension Fusion's Pensions Values engine. This ensures we're providing the correct revalued deferred benefits for dashboards. With the data prepared, the next step was configuring scheme level details and signpost data. Loading member data from our admin system is simple, and if we need to make the occasional updates, we can do that directly in Pension Fusion, which is ideal for a small scheme. We can add any additional warning or unavailable codes that become required directly through the UI, and as often as we like, we can do a full data refresh. We plan to do it once a year. Once the data is loaded, the final step is testing matching. Pension Fusion enables you to design your own matching criteria, but also offers default match criteria, which our trustees decided to use. We ran a data readiness report to test the effectiveness of the criteria. We can also test what receiving a match looks like using the Find Matching test. This helps us gear up for what receiving real matches and possible matches will be like, and how we will ensure possible matches are resolved. These are the personal details returned, and these are the pension values returned. These steps mean we're fully prepared to connect to dashboards and meet our duties with confidence.
As trustees, we feel confident that our scheme is ready for dashboards. Pension Fusion has made the process simple and efficient, and we are well placed to meet our obligations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed to Rob and Natalie for that film. I hope that was enlightening for you. We'll come on to our panel discussion now, but please remember that Rebecca, who's with us today, has been part and parcel of that process that Fujifilm has been through. So if you have specific questions on that process, please feel free to put them into the Q&A, and I'm sure Rekha will be happy to help answer them. So let's go to the panel discussion. We have 3 topics, as I mentioned earlier on. The first one is duties, expectations and consequences. And I'm going to ask our panelists some questions, and we'll see what their thoughts are in response to those questions. Joe, I'm going to start with you on this one, if that's okay. For smaller schemes approaching the dashboard's connection deadline, what does being on track actually look like from the pensions regulator's perspective? And what evidence would you expect trustees to be able to demonstrate that they are properly planning for their dashboard's duties?
Hi, Mark. So from TPR's point of view, being on track means trustees can show that they have a clear plan. They've engaged with those supporting them with dashboard's duties, such as their administrator, their ISP, AVC providers, and they've started work on their data readiness. We would expect to see a simple project plan, evidence of supplier discussions, and an early review of their matching data. Dashboards should appear on their risk register. Trustees should be receiving regular progress updates. In short, we just want to see that schemes know how they connect, who's doing what, and that the work is already underway and not being left to the last minute.
Thanks very much indeed, Joe. Rekha, one for you, if I may. Where do you see dashboards sitting in the wider list of scheme priorities? And how do you encourage trustee boards to position it?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think, from a trustee perspective, we consider dashboards to be just a core regulatory compliance priority. So there's nothing optional about any of it. And whether you're working on a large scheme or a small scheme, we're going to position very much as a regulatory obligation on a par with, say, doing your scheme return or doing your chair's statement. I think more specifically, it really helps to think about dashboards, not so much as an IT project, but as Joe was alluding to several times, thinking of it as a data quality programme. And the benefits of improving data for dashboards are going to stretch well beyond just the dashboards project itself. And I think another way I sort of think about it and try to prioritise it with my boards is thinking about it as an opportunity for a broader governance improvement. So clearly there is a lot of focus from both TPR and DWP, quite rightly, on improving the governance of pension schemes. So having good governance around dashboards connection is just part of delivering a very well-run pension scheme, which is ultimately going to be in the interest of members. Then I think maybe if we sort of move more into a practical perspective around this, I think it is helpful to think about dashboards in 4 different work streams. And the first one we've talked about a lot, data readiness, making sure that the plan data is in good shape, it's going to deliver the results you need under the matching rules. The second is that more of that IT project, so planning for connection, and the practicalities that you need to lead up to the switch on. The third is really around making sure that you've got the resources and the budget needed. So there's going to be increased administration requirements, there's going to be the ISP requirements to connect. So you need to think about how that's going to be resourced. And then the fourth is, as I mentioned before, about the ensuring that you've got the good governance. So making sure you've got the policies in place for the oversight and the reporting that's going to be required.
Thanks, Rekha. I mean, that's an interesting point you make there, that it's an opportunity, this, isn't it, to improve member service, to improve governance and control. So I think what you're saying is that we should try and see it as something which can enable those things to happen, rather than just a process that we need to go through.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just one quick follow-up question on data, Rekha, if you don't mind, and without giving away any confidentialities, of course. Looking across the schemes that you're personally involved with, how does data generally look, would you say, from a dashboard's point of view?
I think it's very varied. And I think when we're talking about smaller schemes, and maybe I'm sort of using my example from Fujifilm here, I think sometimes when you've got smaller schemes and you have in-house admin, actually data can be really good. There's sort of a closeness of the administrator to the individuals involved in the scheme. So I mean, clearly different schemes are in different levels when it comes to where their data's at. There is always going to be gaps. It's not positive. I mean, for Fujifilm, a lot of it was around the gaps were around email addresses, and we've taken some steps to try and improve that, which obviously will be helpful from a dashboard perspective. But yeah, I think smaller schemes with in-house admin can often have pretty good data, not always, but it can be in good shape.
Excellent, thank you for that. Email addresses are always a problem, no matter what the scheme is, how it's managed. There's just not enough of those collected, generally speaking, I think. Maurice, on to you, if I may, on this general topic. From the implementation point of view, how do all those regulatory expectations that we heard of from Joe, how do they translate into a realistic project plan for a small scheme such as Fujifilm and Recca's involvement there? What should they now be doing to avoid last-minute pressures?
Yeah, I think Joe and Recca have set out very clearly what needs to be looked at in terms of general governance and getting this project off the ground, looking at the regulators' guidance. I think in terms of the really urgent things to look at to avoid last-minute pressure, I would say starting with thinking about connection deadlines, having an actual connection deadline in mind that you're going to target, liaising with other parties that are involved in that. If the scheme has other sections, or if there's AVC providers that are going to be connecting as well, making sure that you can have a sort of an agreed connection deadline that's going to be used by all parties, because that's something that needs to be achieved. Then I think when you look at selecting providers, and if you do need to be thinking about contracting with an ISP, as many in-house administered schemes would need to do, then it's really important to start looking at that as early as you can. I think the contracting process with ISPs, it can be quite a long process. I think legal advisors have got much more experience of it now than they had back in sort of April of last year. But it is a new service. It's got new data flows. It does attract various sort of legal sort of issues that need to be thought through in the contract. So I think allowing time for that is really important. And then going back to something that Joe particularly sort of mentioned around pension values, getting pension values in a position where they are ready to show on dashboards might involve creating a new process, might be a new annual process that you need to do to produce that, particularly if you have a DB scheme. The deferred members in a DB scheme typically don't have that data revalued every year, the data that's needed for dashboards. So that's a particularly important thing to look at and work out how you're actually going to do that. In terms of an actual sort of mini project plan, what that looks like, I think you'd probably say it would be comfortable to look to do the implementation of the actual ISP over 3 months. But some of those other activities may well take longer because there'll be different parties involved in it. When you look at what implementing an ISP looks like, you've got activities like capturing the way you're going to configure it, being trained on how you're going to operate it, because administrators will need to use a new user interface to do some of the work that they need to do, getting those data uploads, as Natalie showed us in the Fujifilm video, testing match criteria, and then eventually you register the scheme with a connection date, which is normally a good few working days before you actually connect on that connection date. So an outline plan, 3 months is comfortable, can be compressed if needs to be done.
Excellent, Maurice, thank you. I mean, that sounds, everybody, it sounds like there's a lot to do, and there is, but don't forget there are people who can guide you. So there are experts around who can help you through that process. Let's go on to our second topic, which is governance, decision-making and trustee support. And I'm going to start, Recca, with you, please. From your experience, where do schemes most often get stuck with dashboards? Is it, for example, understanding what they need to do, as I was alluding to there? Is it turning TPR guidance into a workable plan? Is it making decisions on suppliers like ISP connection if they're in-house managed, or chasing through their third-party administrator if they're outsourced? or is it something else? Can you give us a feel for that?
I think, yeah, all of the above, Mark. I mean, I'd say I'd agree with you. I think the first area that trustees can often get stuck is really around understanding duties and timelines around dashboards. I think there is the risk that schemes and trustees can underestimate the complexity of the regulations, and as a result, it then doesn't end up sufficiently high up the priority list. So I think not recognising it as a priority is often the first place that schemes get stuck. But once the decision has been made to prioritise it and to think about it, the second place is really around developing a clear plan for that connection. And you know, we've all talked about the importance of a plan, and I think it's so important. I think smaller schemes might struggle to translate some of the standards, which are pretty technical, translating those into a project plan with very clear responsibilities and sequencing it is quite tough. But I mean, I think the reality is that service providers and the governance specialists involved and advisors, they can all help with this, but only once the scheme has gone through that process of appointing the right advisors and working out who they need to work with. And I think that's probably the third area where schemes get stuck, is actually deciding who is their support in this. And I mean, just to sort of take a step back, schemes can obviously theoretically connect directly to the dashboard's ecosystem, but when we're talking about smaller schemes, there will inevitably need to be a third-party ISP involved. So if you've got a third-party administrator, your TPA is typically going to identify that connection route for you. So they'll select and work with an ISP that they'll use across all their clients, or they'll build their own connection directly. But when we have schemes like Fujifilm who have that in-house administration function, the choice is either going to be transfer that admin to a TPA or find an ISP that you can connect with directly. And I think the sooner a scheme makes the decision on which way they're going to go and which party they're going to appoint, the faster that party can help to support you with your project plan. Talked quite a bit about the problems. I mean, it might be a little bit more constructive, perhaps, if I talk about some of the solutions to these problems. And I think the first one is relatively easy, I say, and it's really to get informed. So there is a lot of material out there to help trustees and companies to understand their responsibilities. There are parties out there who can support trustees with training and guidance. You need to be able to understand how dashboards work, what your duties are, what the data flows are, what compliance looks like, and use those resources out there from TPR, from PDP, and joining webinars like this one to just help build that foundational knowledge in order to sort of start that plan. And then the second recommendation, really, and I guess it's pretty obvious from what we've been saying, is to sort of develop and document that really clear plan. So identify the roles and responsibilities, work out who you want to work with, who your advisors are, who are your service providers, what's your governance around the project, what's the timescales for completion, not just of actually connection, but the key steps on the way to completion. And that is quite a long list of things to sort. So if you don't have the in-house resources to do that, think about whether you can outsource some of that project management. And maybe, sorry, I know I talk quite a lot here, but there's a couple more points that might be quite helpful. The first one really is about supporting data quality initiatives. So any work you do around data is going to have wider consequences and wider benefits for your scheme. But ultimately, dashboards isn't going to work unless scheme data, including values, isn't consistently good. And the second, and perhaps the most important part, is I think is just to keep communicating. So don't save dashboards for quarterly trustee meetings. Keep regular dialogue with all the parties involved to make sure it stays on track. So where you've got a DB scheme and AVCs, make sure that both providers, both administrators are talking to each other. And I'd suggest what we did with Fujifilm and I've done with other schemes is to have either fortnightly or monthly dashboard update calls with the respective providers just to make sure that things are on track.
Thank you, Rebecca. Joe, I'm going to come to you next, but just before I do, just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions that are occurring to you, please put them into the Q&A and we'll do our best to pick them up later on. So, Joe, everything that Rebecca was talking about there, does that reflect what TPR would consider good trustee governance when it comes to dashboards prep for smaller schemes?
I think Rekha explained it very, very well about it is meeting our expectations. It is, Rekha was very clear in sort of, it is all about that planning. It's having the evidence showing how you made those decisions. So have decision logs. Just to plug in something that might be beneficial for smaller schemes who maybe are still in their early part of their planning is we have actually produced a checklist, and this provides so it breaks down the dashboard's preparation into clear, manageable steps so that trustees know exactly what they should be thinking about. It won't have all the detail, but it gives you that sort of high level to start those plans, and that's sort of covering sort of what we would be expecting them to demonstrate to us, how they got to that plan, and it sort of highlights that. So it's quite good for giving a bit of focus to those smaller schemes. But really everything Rekha said is what we are expecting schemes, and it's just to have that evidence of how they did it. Like I said earlier, it's not about being perfect, it's how they got to that decision and how they got there, and if things aren't perfect, it's sort of how they're planning to rectify any issues that they're coming across. This is why it's so important to have this period of time to sort of test and check everything is working right before it does go live to the public. But just bear in mind, it is actually live at the moment during that user testing.
Excellent. Yeah, very good reminder. Thank you very much, Jo. Maurice, what decisions can make these projects run more smoothly, especially where schemes have limited resource of their own?
Yeah, so I think there's probably two areas that come to mind where decision making can really be sped up to support implementation. One is around matching criteria and choosing them. What you will hopefully find is that most ISPs will have a house view default approach to matching, which is similar to the approach taken by third-party administrators who tend to have a house view that they've put together. And that's been used by other clients. The case of Fusion has been used by a lot of clients. But what you can then do with that house view is you can check that it works with your scheme data, which is exactly what Natalie explained that Fujifilm had done. And you can make any amendments to it that you then want to make, because it is actually a trustee decision. But being able to have that starting point is really helpful, because if you just try to start thinking about matching without any guidance, without any sort of input from what other schemes have done, it's difficult. The other thing, of course, you can look at is the PASA guidance, and you can check that any defaults that are being proposed are in line with the approaches that PASA recommend. So I think that's one area where you can really sort of speed up the whole process. I think the second area is when it comes to providing pension values. There are some points of decision that come up, particularly around the more sort of edge cases where you might have cases such as pension sharing or members over NRA, where you need to make decisions about what you're going to show and whether you're going to make use of some of the warning codes that are available to actually display on dashboards, and also how you're going to include data from ABC providers, which comes up time and again in any sort of discussion around implementing schemes on dashboards, big or small. If there's ABC providers to consider, you need to decide how you're going to do that. Again, there's some really helpful PASA guidance that covers those two areas, but if they can be fast-tracked in terms of decisions, making good use of what other schemes and trustees have decided, because we're a long way down the track now in terms of decisions being made by other schemes, then I think that's the best way of speeding up that process.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Maurice. On to our third topic, which is about the practical journey through to connection. And I'm going to come straight back to you here, Maurice, if I may. What are the most common misconceptions, would you say, about using an ISP to connect to dashboards? And then how can implementation be more manageable or be made more manageable for smaller teams?
Yeah, sure. So, and I think for me, probably the most common misconception is that once your scheme is connected to dashboards, that the ISP is going to do everything for you. and it's going to achieve that ongoing sort of dashboard's compliance. And I think it's not always true. It isn't true, but it's the extent to which it's true probably varies. And just to sort of bring that to life a bit, so if you think what an ISP is actually doing once you have it running for you, so the most important thing you could argue it's doing, the most basic thing, is responding to FIND requests. It's actually responding to every single FIND request that gets sent out from anybody using the Money Helper dashboard, which is currently live, as Joe pointed out just now. And yes, the ISP carries that out for you. You don't have to worry about it. It happens in the background. But then it's up to administrators to handle other aspects of that process where savers are searching for their pensions. A particular aspect is the possible match process, where if you respond with a possible match, it might be your member, you're not 100% sure. It's over to the administrators to handle that and carry out that work. A second area is responding to view responses. So clearly dashboard users will want to see the values of their pension. The ISP does that. It's sitting there in the background, so you don't have to worry about the fact that that view response has gone to the dashboard. But if that data isn't immediately available, then it's up to administrators to actually calculate those pension values. And if you've decided to not pre-calculate them, but fall back on that 3 or 10 working day period that you can have to calculate it instead under the regulations, then that's something that administrators need to carry out. And it's a really important part of the whole dashboard experience. Last area is compliance reporting. So ISPs will provide certain data into the dashboard's ecosystem automatically. There's something called the PDP reporting standards that you may be familiar with. That data is covered by those. However, it's up to administrators to monitor their ongoing compliance. And there's various aspects of that that have nothing to do with the reporting standards that administrators need to be aware of. So there's quite a few jobs for the administrators in addition to the ISP. But ISPs can help out with this, and they can get involved in these areas to a greater extent. So just going through the 3 areas again, I mean, when it comes to possible matches and responding to FIND requests, how can ISPs help? So I think the first and most important way they can help is to support really good criteria for possible matches that aren't too wide. So as an example of this, if you define a possible match because you know some of your national insurance numbers are suspect in terms of the data that you hold. So you take the national insurance number, surname, date of birth test, but you drop national insurance number completely and say, well, if surname and date of birth match, that's okay. We'll see. We'll then invite that saver to come and talk to us and work out whether they are our member or not. Now that can be an issue because by just inviting everyone with the same surname and date of birth, there are going to be a number of people out there in the UK for common surnames that are going to actually get a return for that. And you'll have to work through them and deal with them and close them off if they turn out to not be your member. A better way of doing that might be to include national insurance number, but actually say if it's a close match, if there's been a typo, if something's a bit amiss with it, then actually that's when we're going to give the possible match. So we think it's NI number's close and the other two data items are actually okay. And that's a better way of doing it. And if your ISP can support that kind of approach, then that can be really useful because it reduces those numbers of possible matches. Secondly, just looking at the request for view data. So ISPs can also support administrators when they have to do the work, to do the calculations in 3 or 10 working days. But even more importantly, ISPs can also support administrators in actually calculating those values. And Natalie described in the Fujifilm example how they've made use of a pension value service where Fusion has actually calculated those values for them, and they can actually then just use that service as well. So the best approach is to try and make sure they are all pre-calculated, but if not, the ISP can really support in alerting administrators, making sure they can see what needs to be calculated and making sure that nothing gets missed and it does get loaded up in the 3 or 10 working days. Last but not least is the area of compliance reporting. The more ISPs are involved in supporting administrators, the more they can give a more rounded, complete view as to what it means to be fully compliant. There's an awful lot of things to think about in compliance reporting. PASA has some guidance that is coming out very shortly now. It's compliance monitoring guidance, a slightly dry title for a set of guidance, but hopefully it's going to be really helpful for the industry to see everything brought together. And it's all essential information for trustees. As Rekha said at the start, this, in its simplest form, this is a set of regulations backed up by a set of standards, and trustees need to remain compliant with them. And connection is just the very first step in that. What happens when these requests come through is the key sort of thing going forward to say, are trustees remaining compliant with the regulations? So yes, that's how I'd cover that one, Mark.
Thank you very much, Maurice. Lots of information there. Rekha, one for you. What were the critical decisions or actions that made Fujifilm's implementation smoother? And would you recommend that others copy from that approach?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say probably the one thing, it's not going to be particularly helpful maybe if you're watching and you only just starting on your dashboard's connection journey now, but I think Fujifilm really benefited from making an early decision on how we were going to connect. Connection is often the biggest dependency for the rest of the project, and we were cognizant that there was the risk that capacity across the broader market might tighten as we got closer and closer to that October deadline. So we did want to start early, and actually, I think Rob may have mentioned it. We started discussions in the middle of 2024, noting that our connection date wasn't actually until February 26th. This was mostly a positive. I'd say it did have some drawbacks. I think, as we were moving early, we were thinking about issues that a lot of other smaller schemes hadn't actually got to yet. So I think, there's probably a benefit for other schemes for thinking about it now, that they can maybe, jump off the back of some of the work that we've done and that other smaller schemes have done and that providers have done in terms of finding solutions and ways to help. So I think things are probably easier now than they were for us back in 24. But sorry, coming back to the sort of Fujifilm specific project, I think obviously we knew that we were going to have to find a third party, and we used sort of our contacts in the industry. We were directed towards Lumera and had a couple of meetings quite early on to understand pension fusion and how it could support in that small scheme environment. And we felt quite quickly very confident that we could use fusion instead of the alternative option for us, which is really to think about moving to a third party administrator. And once we got that sort of decision made, we were then able to sort of start on that project planning, taking us through to the connection date. We really benefited from using the data readiness services. So to understand how the matching criteria that we were thinking about would sort of be tested, so that we understood how the data sort of stood up to that criteria. And another key benefit, and we've touched on this a couple of times, is around how the values are created. And as Natalie mentioned in the video, Fujifilm decided to use the Pensions Fusion's value engine. It's quite a mouthful, that. And that clearly reduced the burden on the in-house team to carry out those calculations individually. And then I think finally, I've said this before, but I think that really helped us with getting Fujifilm to a successful connection in February was around the communication piece. We had frequent check-ins with Lumera. I'm sure I drove them a little bit mad, but we had lots of conversations with different members of the team to make sure we were on track. We brought in the DC provider to make sure their project plan was aligned. We had a steering committee which included representatives from the company, so everybody was sort of owning the project and really sort of championing getting to that end point. And maybe actually the final point I'd say around what helped us was really staying up to date on the PDP program more widely. And I think Maurice was a super help with that, because dashboards did evolve from the middle of 24 to the point that we connected. So getting updates on how what we were doing fitted into the broader context and what we needed to think about post connection, that was all really helpful. So staying abreast of dashboards as you work through the project was a big help.
It's great guidance. Thank you, Rekha. Joe, I'm going to ask you to kind of mark Fujifilm's work for the second time today, actually. So could you just comment briefly, if you would, on how you feel an approach like Fujifilm's equates to what TPR would be looking for from smaller schemes?
Without giving that sort of a standard, because obviously I don't work in our compliance and enforcement team, but I would say Fujifilm's approach does align quite well with our expectations from smaller schemes, but actually all schemes. Smaller schemes are no different to the larger schemes when it comes to our expectations. But what they did was that they engaged early, they identified their connection route, and they've been actively monitoring their progress. This is something that we're really keen to be seeing schemes and trustees being involved in this process. They built familiarity with the systems. This is a new system they've probably never had to deal with before. So they're giving themselves time to understand so that they can deal with any queries that might arise. And this is sort of exactly sort of moving into that operational readiness that we're starting to see, sort of shifting from just being connection ready. It's looking at what happens next, because it isn't about, it's only a small part of this whole journey for dashboards connection. It's now looking at that next bit. As Record said, like, it's all about that good preparation, having a clear plan, sort of maintaining that control of it. I've seen through my engagement that some schemes still struggle with coordinating everybody, their administrators, their ISPs. That's where delays can arise as well. So we are expecting that trustees are leading this coordination and sort of setting realistic expectations and milestones, but to keep their oversight tight over that. We've given practical examples in our sort of guidance about what sort of good looks like and how to sort of document their decisions. But I think as a part of sort of when we're talking about those controls, that one of those key parts, and Maurice was talking about it, is really understanding that matching performance. Does it fit the scheme? Does it meet those expectations? Are you getting too many partial sort of matches, and the impact that can have on your administration, those queries coming in? So the trustees having that sort of visibility of that core data quality, understanding any of the gaps and things like that, is all really good for the trustees to sort of make sure that their matching criteria is on track. So it does sort of meet everything. And one thing I did take away is sort of, because we were talking about using the right sort of calculation tools. This means by using sort of calculation tools, means that you can return data immediately when the saver's using the dashboard. So that will have a better outcome, rather than maybe relying on sort of a timeline after your members have first use the dashboards, and sort of waiting up to 10 days to receive sort of information. They're using something digital now. People are expecting things on demand. So it's quite good to see that Fujifilm were using tools and looking at how they can provide values quickly to their members to keep them well informed.
Excellent. Thank you, Jo. Thank you very much. We've got about 5 minutes left. We've got a couple of questions that have come in, so let's try to look at those briefly. The first one is, I noticed in the Fujifilm example they had provided ERI information as well as revalued pensions for DB deferreds. As I understand it, ERI information is not mandatory for DB deferreds. However, is it encouraged? For small schemes where the cost of dashboards is potentially unwelcome, those costs for additional calculations may not be something trustees want to bear. So Maurice, one for you, I think, if you could. But as I say, if you can keep your response brief, that would be helpful. Thank you.
No, I will. Thanks, Mark. So yeah, one thing to say is the Fujifilm example. So there was test data in there, but in terms of what Fujifilm have done, so ERI does need to be provided as a record, but what most schemes do is they use an unavailable code to say that they're not going to provide it. So they use a code called the DB unavailable code. Money Helper then picks that up, the dashboard, and it understands that where you've used the DB code, then essentially the accrued value that you've provided can be treated as if it's an ERI as well. So it can be added up, if you like, with the other ERIs that are available and treated in that way. To your question about actually whether any schemes are actually going to the effort of producing an ERI. So I have not encountered
Maurice, it might just be worth explaining what an ERI is, just in case there's anybody not aware of that on the call.
Good point, thanks, Mark. So there's two pension values that are provided for dashboards. So one is an accrued entitlement, and the ERI is the second one, which is an estimated retirement income. And the concept for deferred members in DB schemes was always that because the two things are kind of the same, really. So if you were to try and calculate an ERI for a deferred member in a DB scheme, you'd do a calculation that would end up with another version of what you already had as the accrued value. So that was fed into the regulations to start with, to say you don't have to provide this. And yeah, I must admit, I'm trying to think, I don't think in my experience I've seen anybody provide it yet, for those reasons.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Maurice. And the second question, Rekha, I'm going to ask you to answer this one if you would. Who in your experience has driven the Data Protection Impact Assessment, DPIA? Has it been TPAs, as in are they providing one for the trustees to use? Or has it been trustees after consulting legal advisors? And the question goes on, ultimately the trustees are responsible for ensuring there is one. However, schemes where professional trustees are involved would have more insight into this and perhaps find it easier to produce than, say, a scheme that is run by lay trustees. Could you comment on that, Rekha?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen a lot of DPIAs over the last few months, probably more than I'd ever want to see, if I'm honest. And I think maybe the key point is that your TPA may well have a DPIA in relation to dashboards, but as trustees, this is a DPIA for you. You're the data controller. So even if your TPA has one, I think it would be good practice in most cases for the scheme to do a separate DPIA. In terms of how that's produced, it has varied from scheme to scheme. So at Lord Adventure, we have a governance team who supported us in developing sort of standards that we then tweak for our individual schemes depending on what they need. In some cases where there's more complexity, we definitely take legal advice on that. I'm aware of other schemes where the legal advisors have been more taken a more central role in terms of drafting them. And I'm involved with another scheme where the in-house team has drafted it and then the trustees has a look at it. So the actual process of it can vary depending on what your resources are and your familiarisation with the DPIA structure. But ultimately, it is a trustee document, so there should really be one specifically for dashboards, which belongs to the trustee's own.
Thank you very much, Rekha. Thank you. That brings our webinar to a close. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and thank you, of course, to our speakers. I said that my only job was to make sure we finished on time. I'm just probably going to fail by about a minute, so I do apologise. But let me just say we'll be publishing our recording online, and we will contact you to let you know where you can find it if you'd like to watch it back or pass it on to colleagues. Just 3 or 4 points that I'm going to focus on that have come out of today. Get started now was a clear message. Have a clear plan was another key message. See pensions dashboards connection as an opportunity to improve service and to improve trustee governance. And there's plenty of materials around. So the TPR website, PDP, PASA. If anybody's not familiar with PASA, PASA is the Pensions Administration Standards Association. Lots of material out there to feed off, but also people in the industry here to help if you would like that help. We hope you found it a really useful hour of your time. Good luck with connecting your scheme to the ecosystem, and we hope to welcome you to another Lumera webinar soon. Thank you very much, everybody. Cheerio.